The doctor lifted the shield, and I called my son to pick me up, but he said he was already on his way. What I didn't know was that while I was still sitting in that clinic, something in my house had already been changed without my permission. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Richard. I'm 69 years old, and I spent most of my life working with numbers. Not the kind you guess at, but the kind you check twice, then once more before signing your name. After I retired, that habit didn't leave me. My days were simple. Same chair, same tea, same quiet order in the house I'd lived in for over 30 years. When my vision started to fade, I adjusted the way people do. Larger print, slower steps, fewer risks. I never liked depending on anyone, but I knew this surgery was one of those things you couldn't manage alone. The ride home was quiet. My son kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his phone at red lights. He told me not to worry about anything, that he'd handled things while I was gone. I didn't ask what that meant. I've learned that when people say that, they usually have something specific in mind. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the front hedge had been trimmed differently. Not wrong, just not how I used to do it. I let it go. Small things don't need attention right away. Inside, the house felt familiar, but not settled. That's the only way I can describe it. Like walking into a room where someone had moved things, just enough that your body notices before your eyes do. The hallway table was a few inches to the left. A lamp had been replaced. My son carried my bag in and told me to sit. I reorganized a bit, he said. Made things easier for you. I nodded and thanked him. It sounded reasonable, and at that point, I needed things to be simple. The first night, I stayed mostly in the living room. My vision was still cloudy, shapes soft around the edges. I relied on memory more than sight. I knew where the kitchen was without looking. I knew how many steps to the hallway. But when I reached for a drawer where I kept my reading glasses, it wasn't there. My son said he'd moved some items for better access. He handed me the glasses from another room. I said nothing. There was no need to question it yet. The next morning I woke early, like always. The house was quiet, but not in the way I remembered. There was a faint hum coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I followed it slowly, one hand brushing the wall. It led me toward my study. The door was closed. That was new. I tried the handle, but it didn't move. Locked. I stood there for a moment, not thinking much, just noting it. When my son woke up, I asked about it. He said he'd been sorting things out in there and didn't want dust getting into the rest of the house. I accepted that answer the way you accept something that sounds logical, but doesn't fully settle. Over the next few days, the same pattern continued. Small changes, small explanations, always reasonable, never complete. The study stayed closed more often than not. Sometimes I heard movement behind the door, not constant, just enough to register. When I asked, he said he was working. Just temporary, he added once, like it was meant to reassure me. I started noticing his schedule. He came and went at odd times, late mornings, early afternoons, sometimes evenings. I didn't track it closely, but I noticed enough to see it wasn't random. One afternoon, I heard voices in the hallway. Low, unfamiliar. By the time I reached the door, there was no one there. My son said a friend had stopped by to drop something off. I nodded. That explanation, like the others, sat in the right place but didn't quite settle into it. I spent more time sitting quietly after that, not because I was tired, but because it gave me space to observe. When you don't react, people show more of what they're doing. The house had its own rhythm now, one I wasn't fully part of. Doors opening, closing, soft footsteps, occasional voices. The study door became a kind of center point for all of it. Always involved, never explained fully. I didn't push. I let it build on its own. One evening, I went through my mail at the kitchen table. Utility bills, mostly. I've always kept an eye on those. Habit. The numbers were higher than usual. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Electricity, internet usage, small increases, but consistent. I didn't say anything. Numbers don't lie, but they don't explain themselves either. They wait for you to connect them to something real. I folded the papers neatly and set them aside. The next day, I called an old colleague of mine. We used to work together for years. He still kept up with things online, knew his way around systems I didn't bother with anymore. I asked him a simple favor. Check something for me, I said, and gave him my address. I didn't explain why. He didn't ask. Some people understand when something doesn't need to be said yet. He told me he'd look into it and call me back. When he did, his voice was steady, but slower than usual. You might want to see this yourself, he said. He sent me a few links and came over later that day to help me go through them. We sat at my table, and he read things out loud while I looked closely, adjusting to the light. Photos of a workspace, a desk I recognized, shelves I had arranged myself years ago, descriptions written in simple terms. Quiet office space available, shared home environment. My address was right there. I didn't react, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. It explained the voices, the schedule, the locked door. It connected the small changes into something complete. My study hadn't just been reorganized, it had been turned into something else, something being used, something being offered. I asked my colleague to print everything, listings, dates, anything tied to it. He did, without comment. We stacked the papers neatly when we were done. That night, I sat in my chair longer than usual. The house was quiet again, or maybe I just wasn't listening the same way. My son came in and asked if I needed anything. I said no. He stood there for a second, like he wanted to say more, then left. I watched him go and realized something simple. This hadn't been done in a moment. It had been built over time. Decisions layered quietly, without asking. That's how most things change, not all at once, but in steps you don't stop. The next morning, I made a few calls, practical ones. I contacted a property advisor I'd worked with years ago, explained the situation without emotion, asked him to sit in on a conversation. Then I organized the documents, printed copies, arranged by date. When you've spent your life working with records, you know how to present something clearly. There's no need to raise your voice when the information speaks on its own. By the afternoon, everything was ready. I asked my son to sit down with me that evening. He looked surprised, maybe because I don't usually ask like that. We sat at the same table where I had reviewed the bills. The advisor joined us, polite, neutral. I placed the papers on the table and slid them forward. I'd like you to explain this, I said. My voice was steady. No pressure in it, just a request. My son looked at the pages, then at me, then back at the pages again. He started with what I expected. It's temporary, he said. Just something to help with money. He talked about demand, about unused space, about efficiency. The words were organized, almost rehearsed. I let him finish. Then the advisor spoke. Not accusing, just explaining. Use of property, consent, liability. The kind of things that don't sound dramatic but carry weight. The room stayed quiet between each sentence. No one rushed to fill the silence. When it was my turn again, I didn't repeat anything. I simply laid out the choice. End it immediately. Remove the listings. Restore the space. Document everything properly. Or we proceed formally, with all that comes with it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I just said it. And waited. My son didn't answer right away. He looked down at the table. Hands still. For the first time, he didn't have a quick explanation ready. He asked for a little time. I nodded. Take it, I said. He left the room, and I stayed where I was. The advisor gathered his papers quietly and told me to call if I needed anything else. When my son came back, his voice was different. Quieter. He said he would stop everything, that he would fix it. I didn't respond with approval or relief. I just said, "Good, then start tomorrow." And that was the end of the conversation. Over the next few days, the house changed again. This time, I watched it return. The study door stayed open. Furniture moved back, slowly, like it was remembering where it belonged. There were no more voices in the hallway, no unfamiliar footsteps. The small hum I'd heard before disappeared. My son worked quietly without explaining every step. That was fine. Some things don't need explanation once they've been understood. A few weeks later, my vision had improved enough that I didn't need to move as carefully. I walked down the hallway without touching the wall. I stopped at the study door and stood there for a moment. It was open. Inside, everything looked the way it used to. The desk in its place, the shelves aligned. Even the chair was positioned the way I had left it months ago. I stepped in slowly and ran my hand across the desk surface. My son stood behind me, not saying anything, just there. After a moment, he asked, "Anything else need fixing?" I thought about the question for a second. Then I said, "No." Not because everything was the same, but because what needed fixing had already been handled. We stood there in silence for a while. Then he left the room, closing the door gently, but not all the way. I sat down in my chair and looked around. The room felt steady again, not untouched, but settled. I understood something clearly in that moment. Control doesn't disappear suddenly. It shifts when you stop noticing the small changes, when you let things pass without asking what they mean, and bringing it back doesn't require noise, just attention and the willingness to act. When the pattern becomes clear, these days the house is quiet again, not empty, just calm. My son still visits, but not in the same way. There's a distance now, not cold, just measured. We speak when there's something to say. We don't fill the space unnecessarily. That seems to work better. It gives things room to settle properly without forcing them into place too quickly. Sometimes I sit in that study in the late afternoon, light coming through the window the way it always has. I go through the old papers, not because I need to, but because I can. It reminds me that order isn't just about where things are. It's about knowing why they're there. And when that changes, you have to decide whether to ignore it or correct it. Control isn't taken in a single moment. It fades in small allowances you don't question at the time. And if you want it back, you don't argue for it. You simply take it quietly and put things where they belong.